Welcome everyone. I love it. I love seeing you all flood into into the salon, into the seminar room. Thanks so much for joining us. This is one of our Oxford English Faculty, Oxford World's Classics Shakespeare webinars. We take one play per month, and over the next almost 3 years, we will finish the canon. We've been doing a year already, so you can catch up with those on YouTube if you haven't got them so far. The format is always the same. I'm in conversation as the general editor for the series with the person who wrote the introduction. And today on Richard II, that's Hailey Bachrach. So I'm delighted Hailey's with us. I'm just going to keep talking before I let her get a word in edgeways, just to outline what we do. So we've got an hour and a quarter on this call. Do use the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen to post any questions, and I'll keep an eye on those and try and get through as many as we can at the end. But don't wait. Lynn has already kicked us off. Thank you, Lynn. Don't wait until the end if you've got questions, because we might not get to them all at that point. And also to say two things that we always say, but they should be repeated, to think about the Oxford World's Classics. So we are the sort of publishing diffusion line of the high-end academic couture, which is the new Oxford Shakespeare, edited by Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Borus, and Gabriel Egan. And in particular, Anna Pruitt, who edited Richard II, the text that Hailey is introducing. So there's loads and loads and loads of information, technical, scholarly information about textual matters, as well as information about the history and the criticism of the plays in those big editions. But our versions are intended for readers are all at all levels and theatre goers, and that's sort of how we're pitching the conversation. Brilliant. And the last thing to say, so before I introduce Hailey properly, is I first encountered Hailey's work when I read her PhD thesis, which was later published as Female Characters in Shakespeare's English History Plays, and I so admired it for its kind of pizzazz and clarity, and its ability to go head to head with some quite established forms of scholarship without ever seeming rude or disagreeable, but just energetic and wanting to engage in the conversation. And I thought she's one I want definitely for this series. So I'm delighted that you wrote that introduction, and that we're here to talk about it. Tell me why you picked it, Hailey. I'll give you a chance to speak finally.
Thank you so much. Yeah, as you mentioned, my work has been on the history plays. So when you approached me with the offer to write an introduction, I knew I had to grab onto the history play that was being offered. And as I was actually just saying to you right before, when we were speaking before this began, it was one of those moments where I was like rereading the play in preparation for writing about it and was like, oh yeah, this one's like, it's pretty good, huh? It was,
We're
just
going to
such a
have that
delight.
on the reprint backline. This one's pretty good, huh? I think we're going to
Yeah,
say.
it's like, yeah, it's one of the good ones, I guess. But it really was just, you have a memory of the ones that you like, but it was one of those ones rereading it. I was like, oh no, this is genuinely one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. I really just love it. I think it's really just wonderful. So I was so excited to get to write about it and also to have a vehicle to share more of my many, many thoughts on the history plays, which I will talk about endlessly if given any chance to do.
Fantastic. We're definitely going to do that. We're going to do that today. So let's just start with where it comes in Shakespeare's career, and maybe a bit about that genre of history play.
Yeah, absolutely. So Shakespeare's career sort of began with history plays. I mean, within the various slight minutiae of arguments about exactly when things took place, but some of the earliest plays that he wrote were what we now call the Henry VI plays, not written in the order that we now put them. Doesn't matter. But they were very different in kind of tone and style from the history plays that we get later on. A lot more sort of episodic and bombastic and maybe more exciting in some ways. I love them dearly, but they sort of culminate this little cycle that he did with Richard III, which begins to look a little bit more like the history plays that we get later on. In that it has this kind of central figure and it is shaped a little bit more like a tragedy than like this very kind of episodic action packed saga. And Richard II is then the next history play he writes, and he's writing it in, I think, what most of us would consider one of his most like fruitful periods. This is right around the time of like Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream and like some of the real like classics of his like corpus. And Richard II is right in there with them, and again, sort of continues on in a way from what he started experimenting with in some ways in Richard III of taking a history play and putting it into the kind of shape of a tragedy, and thinking about it as a story of a kind of central figure rather than this sweeping scope of tons of people and tons of events. Obviously, they're all kind of named after one guy, but some of them are less sort of actually focused on that one guy than Richard II is.
Yeah, that's so interesting about those two different ways of thinking. How do you scoop out a play shape from Holinshed's Chronicles or whatever it is? And certainly in those, yeah, you're absolutely right. We'll be talking later in this year about the first two parts of Henry VI. Um, they seem, as you say, much more episodic. They're about different characters vying for sort of theatrical as well as political power. It's slightly difficult to know who you would want to be cast as if you went to a casting call for the Henry VI plays. Bit easier to guess who you'd want to be cast as, I guess, if you went for Richard. Um, how do you think that tragic structure works on the material of the play? I mean, what does it give us of this tragic history?
I mean, I think the obvious thing that we're saying is that it sort of creates a focal point of a single person. Like Richard functions in the play a little bit more almost like Hamlet or somebody than, well, Richard III a little bit, but then Henry VI does in Henry VI, he gives a shape to the story that is the shape of his sort of I would say rise and fall. The rise is very brief, and then it's mostly a very long fall from the rest of the play. And there are other characters, and that's one of the things that I talk about in the introduction. Is I think that the sort of ensemble nature of this play actually has been understated, and there are a lot of really compelling and really important characters that, especially in production, tend to get overlooked to the detriment of the storytelling overall. But they are all sort of orbiting around Richard and orbiting around the question of who is this person and his like status and his place in the world sort of the tone of the play takes on the tone of Richard's life, I guess, in some
Mhm.
ways at various points. When things are going well for him, the play's a little bit lighter, the politics are a little more intricate, and then as it becomes a sort of more and more tragic and despondent situation for him, that then becomes kind of the tone of the story overall as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when I asked you to pick out the passage that you wanted to focus on, you um, sort of thought about what to do and went for, as we'll come to in a few minutes, the uh, Richard's long soliloquy in prison in Act 5, and that, as well as other things, is a sign that he really has become a tragic character rather than a king, because by definition, in a way, a king is never on his own. There's always people around, there's always servants. This is not a place where you can soliloquize. And in prison at the lowest point of the play, Richard enters a sort of, takes on a slightly different role, I suppose. Those other characters are interesting. As you were speaking then, I wondered if we've got a tendency to see the play a little bit, as it were, from Richard's own point of view, as if he is the most important person and everybody else is just sort of, you know, also there, but not really.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think that's how he sees
Yeah.
the world. But I think one of the productions that really kind of made me begin, and I want to say 2014 2014 or 2015. And that was the first time I'd ever seen the play just really feel like a two-hander between Bolingbroke and Richard. It really felt like the actors were not only kind of like equally matched in terms of their sort of charisma and their presence on stage and all of those sort of intangible things, but it felt like the production kind of let them be equals in a way that I feel like you rarely get to see. And it really just opened up the story for me in a completely different way and made me realize that, yeah, as you say, much as Richard wants the whole world to revolve around him, and for everything that happens to him makes no sense to him because why would these things happen to me? The play itself is kind of trying to prove him wrong. And you need the kind of richness and fullness of the other characters, especially Bolingbroke, to kind of do the thing the play is in some ways trying to do, of show Richard as this tragic figure, but also show in the ways his kind of self-styling as a tragic figure is this sort of like egotistical, narcissistic reason that all these things have happened to him because he can't see beyond himself.
Yeah, it's one of the ways tragedy is really a kind of opposite to history, isn't it? Because
Mm.
tragedy kind of assumes there isn't going to be anything after the tragic hero is dead. That's the end of our interest in the story. There's no that there can't be a sort of part two, or we can't go anywhere else because the whole feeling we've got is that everything has sort of burnt itself out. And Richard, I suppose, wants to think that, but he is actually also in a history play where actually the king is dead, long live the king. Life, or monarchical life, or government, or the state of England continues beyond that tragic narrative. I love what you said about him. That being a tragic character becomes egotistical. I was thinking of that moment when he hears about Henry Bolingbroke's sort of advance, and messengers keep coming in and saying, "Oh no, you're the people who said they were on your side have not turned up, or they've gone away, or something." And he has that great speech, doesn't he? "For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings." And you think, actually, that's not what Bolingbroke, the challenger to the throne, is doing. He's he's got a plan and a kind of strategy, and he's doing it. And you're sort of, telling sad stories. That's
Yeah.
why it's not going to work out.
In retrospect, I think I should have picked that speech because I really love it. But yeah, it connects to something I was thinking when you were talking before about how there's like something fundamentally unkingly about this tragic ending because a king is never alone. And one of the things that I don't think I talk about in the introduction, but I talk about in my book that came out a couple of years ago is that for Shakespeare, I find, or I believe, um, not believe, it's not like a thing I decided, like I argue,
Mm.
that there's an inverse relationship between historical power and theatrical power in a lot of the history plays. So the more sort of elevated somebody is in terms of their position in the world, the less ability they have to kind of properly connect to the audience and like marshal the sort of sympathies of the onlookers and take advantage of the kind of like tools of the theater to get things done. And I think not to totally digress, but like the classic example of this is in Richard III, where Richard stops talking to the audience once he becomes king. He sort of loses the ability to really like connect with people until he's about to fall and die in battle again. And I think this happens with Richard II too. He gets at the moment when he's the absolute, lowest he could possibly be in terms of like his station in the world, he's stripped of everything, he's in prison, he's about to be killed. That is when he can give this kind of virtuoso speech and really go from being alone in a prison cell to kind of this reminder that like he's never alone. He has an audience of hundreds of people watching him,
Mm.
the most kind of large and sympathetic audience he's ever had. Yeah, and I think that is I think, talking about how Shakespeare kind of tries to put a history into the shape of a tragedy, I feel like in that way, he's always kind of felt that there's something tragic about history. And he kind of finds these moments when characters who are kind of dispossessed by history kind of get to like switch genres and come be in a tragedy for a little while where they suddenly get this new kind of form of theatrical power in place of like political and historical power.
Oh, that's such a smart remark. So that I see, so that the tragic hero gains in, is the center of the play. So even though their narrative is one of um, sort of extinction or something,
Yeah.
it isn't a defeat. They are
Yeah.
they are the kind of king of their own play. Yeah, and Richard, yeah, that's great. So Richard, yes, Richard, that makes Richard in the I don't know why this is in my mind, but makes Richard in the prison a bit like Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, saying, I'm ready for my close-up," as if somehow an attention has come back to him while the narrative of the play and the narrative of the English polity has been towards Bolingbroke as the new point of interest. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I like that comparison as well because I don't want to like preempt what we might say about the speech, but
We can do the speech now. We don't have a
sure.
particular. Why don't we do it? Why don't we do it?
Yeah.
There's
Um yeah, let's do it.
let's do it. Let's do it. And we are. Let's go. We one before. Here we are. How does that? How is that? I hope everyone can see that. Can you see that, Hailey?
I can, yeah. I'm just now looking to try and find the
So
thing that I'm
this
thinking of.
Yeah, so this is a, I mean, one thing while you're looking at that, I can riff on it a bit. I mean, one thing about it is this is just so long. So
Yes.
66 lines. I remember uh, Greg Doran, who was on our first webinar on Macbeth. Greg Doran has this idea that Shakespeare goes along at about 800 lines an hour, 800 lines an hour, which I've always found really, really useful. That's in the modern stage. It may have been quicker in the Shakespearean one, but that makes 66 lines, quite a few minutes. It's about um, time and the clock and all of that, and it also and music and different ways of conceptualizing time, and it is itself a sort of block of time where Richard is alone on stage and the center of everyone's empathetic attention.
Yeah, and I was starting to say, I really like the comparison to Norma Desmond because around line 50, I mean, line 50, line 40, you can see there's a little stage direction that music starts playing and he kind of responds to and hears this music. So we sort of are given to understand, this is music that is not just the soundtrack of the scene, but that he is hearing as well, that's playing in the world. And he sort of tries to direct the music and is like, oh, keep time and in classic Richard fashion, sort of still trying to order people about. Um, but then, at the end, when the music stops, he's like, "Oh, it's a blessing, a blessing on his heart that gives it me to the sign of love." So it's this mix of like, this self-centeredness, but at the same time, there's something about, her calling to the camera for the close-up, him saying like, "Oh, play my backing track while I soliloquize." This sort of attempt to marshal the kind of effects of the technical like apparatus
The
of
back
the
the
performance
the
space.
backing track is a great image of the sort of modern politician and whatever that sort of walk-on music. I forget what that's called. Um,
Yeah.
but that's really, I hadn't thought of it in that way at all. That's really, really interesting. Yeah, so one of the things about this speech that I'd love to ask you about is the way that grammatically it embodies that um, switch to the personal or switch to being the agent maybe at the center of the play. Richard moves from the we, the sort of royal we, which he always speaks in, to this really emphatic first person, doesn't he? Three times in the first two lines of this scene, I have been studying how I may compare this prison where I live. Um, how do you how do you interpret um, that first the force of that first person?
Yeah, I think as you say, we've always heard him refer to himself as we up to this point. And there's very sort of compelling, weird little exchange in the scene where he is deposed by Bolingbroke. And he has I can't remember the full line, but it's the no, I know, where he's sort of saying yes and no, but also saying like I, as in like AY, but also as in I. Like it's this mixing up of sort of the first person pronoun and his consent to be deposed. And so it's already sort of just like the word I or the letter I is already really kind of symbolically weighted for Richard by the time that we get to this scene. And so, yeah, there is something I think immediately striking about this complete change in mode and tone. He has fully embraced this word that he could barely bring himself to say
Mm.
in the previous scene. Uh, and um, I think it also really contributes to this thing I was saying about how he has a different relationship to the audience in this scene. For him to just sort of like come out alone for the first time in the play, look out to the audience in a not sort of, I'm sure in the performance, I'm sure he's directed things out to the audience, but he hasn't really had much more than like an aside, maybe that's kind of definitely audience directed. But yeah, he comes out alone. He's speaking to the audience for the first time. He calls himself I. There's a sort of like frankness and directness in the way that he just sort of like, whenever I read this, I just picture him like sitting himself down and really like leveling with the audience in a way that he just hasn't ever done before. And I think that that really is an instant illustration of the fact that he has, I mean, of his kind of downfall, for lack of a better word. Like none of his status is left, none of his elevation is left. He's just there talking to the only people he can talk to, which is us nobodies.
And so that puts the length in a slightly different context, doesn't it? Do you feel,
Mm.
is this a sort of raconteur kind of trying to hold our attention with this long speech, or is it a overspilling of thoughts that have not been allowed to be out in, articulated before? How do you take the sort of, I suppose is that a question about sincerity or about tone, I suppose?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think I feel like the question of Richard and sincerity is really interesting. And I feel like every time I've seen it, the actors have a different seem to have a different point of view on when and how and if he is ever sincere. And I do feel like the thing that really, when you asked that, my immediate thought was just that the thoughts in this are so orderly. His imagery is really clear. He has these, very like tidy little sections of metaphor and simile that kind of follow on from one another in a very, yeah, just like neat and easy to follow way. There is something about the thought that doesn't feel like an outpouring or an overspilling. I think even just looking at the text as like blocks of words, he's got one short line at line 15. And then pretty much everything else is just very regular. They usually sort of, the thoughts split in a logical way. And often Shakespeare will sort of use the line breaks and use the punctuation to indicate when a character's thoughts are disordered, when a thought is like spilling across multiple lines, or that kind of stops in a weird place and continues in a weird place, or gets cut short. That's a way that he shows sometimes that like overspilling, as you say, these
Mm,
thoughts that have not had time to kind of percolate.
mm,
And again, I think like thinking of it as a performance text, of course, you can come up with a lot of justifications for this. He's had a long time to think about all this stuff. He's a very intelligent and well-educated person, but there is something, yeah, tidy about it that makes it difficult sometimes to feel that it is completely sincere. But
mm.
I think in some ways that might be, you know, uh, I think that's part of the tragedy of the character is that even he, I think, doesn't know if you keep kind of scraping away the artifice, is there anything
That's
there?
right. Yeah, I mean, sincerity as a value is obviously, I mean, sort of, which is why I hesitated to use it. It's massively kind of overrated, I think, as a value, but also not a very theatrical. It's not a very theatrical value. But yeah, I'm so interested in what you say about the control. I'm just looking at the top of the second column.
Mm.
Um, I was better when a king, thus am I kinged again. And by and by, I think that I am unkinged by Bolingbroke. You're right that this is a sort of rhetorical control, moving from king to king as a noun to king as a verb, and then this unfamiliar verb, which people always say has been invented sort of by Shakespeare or by Richard to capture the unnaturalness of what's happened. You know, you need a new word, but just rhetorically or syntactically, those are in a quite an orderly progression where being having something explained to us rather than, yeah, if you were to look at Macbeth's first soliloquy maybe or something where we don't even really quite know what the referent is of the pronouns sometimes or but yeah, here we've got a really helpfully organized moment of close up. What um uh what uh, what do you think for a history play is the resonance of this long image of the clock, the jack of the clock, which I think was a is that some that's some sort of clock mechanism, isn't it? A
Yeah.
jack of the clock. But that whole thing from wasted time. First we have time as a music something from music, but then we're definitely in time as years or hours passing.
Yeah, I think the first thing it makes me think of is the comment that you made a couple of minutes ago about how a tragedy sort of ends and it's sort of the end of the world in a way when the tragedy ends.
Mm,
But in a history play, there is time either side of this story.
mm,
And when you were saying that before, I was thinking of how even in the last scene of this play, there's sort of this like passing of the tragic baton to Bolingbroke. He has these lines as he's like looking at Richard's corpse, you know, I do protest my soul is full of woe that blood should sprinkle me to make me grow. And then he, you know, makes a vow to go to the Holy Land and crusade in order to like wipe this sin of murder of his predecessor away. So we're kind of like queuing up the next tragedy, even as the previous one has barely finished.
mm,
And I think, yeah, there's something. I think it's hard not to feel like a reference to time is resonant in a history play, and I feel like that to me, reading across all of the plays, Shakespeare is always so aware of the presence of this future that is kind of known to the audience in some ways, and this past that is certainly like, yeah, that is also known to them. And as he writes more and more history plays, sometimes it's known to them because of what he's written, which
yes.
is, you know, interesting as well. Um, the 106 plays come chronologically after
Mm,
Richard II. And so, in a way, he knows kind of the history that the
mm,
audience is looking towards. And there's even references to it in the speech I deliberately didn't pick, the famous speech by John of Gaunt about
mm.
this sceptered isle. Um, uh, a reference to, you know, if you set this house against this house, I can't remember the exact line now, but basically, the War of the Roses will happen, and
Yeah,
won't that
that's
be a
right.
shame?
Yes, yes,
Um,
and the blood of England shall manure the ground, the Bishop of Carlisle, and all of that stuff. Yeah,
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 yeah. But
yeah. I
yes,
love
so
that. Yeah, I'm just still looking at this. My thoughts and minutes.
yeah.
I've always been completely fascinated by reading years ago about the invention of the minute hand on
Ooh.
clocks, and that clocks were all about hours, and the church clock striking every hour. And I think it's a Renaissance invention, sort of highly technical and highly expensive, that minutes are always ticking, and that sort of I seem to remember reading sort of introduces a new sense of time, um, not in chunks, but I suppose in a kind of constant yeah, constantly moving. And
Mhm.
I'm guessing my thoughts and minutes must be slightly. anachronistic, that probably Richard couldn't have done that. But then the sound that tells me what hour it is are clamorous groans which strike upon my heart, which is the bell. Hmm.
I love that. And I also that's so interesting. I want to go read about that now. But I love that as well because there's something in the intellectualizing of the kind of newfangled technology of the minute hand, but the conventional sort of hour is the heart. And I think it feels very kind of in character for Richard, for lack of a better way to put it, because he is throughout the play, like one of his kind of faults as a king is that he loves novelty and he likes expensive things and he wants new stuff and nice wines and, the classic like decadent
Mhm.
king problems. And that is, contrasted to his relatives and the people who oppose him in the early part of the play, his father's brothers, his uncles, the other word I could have used,
Mhm.
who as in this very famous, Sceptered Isle speech, have this very parochial traditional view of what kingship is, what England is, what the world is.
Mhm.
And obviously, the play kind of leans towards overall, they're probably the ones who are right. But there is something really understandably compelling about Richard wanting to take a broader view of kind of life and the world and to
Mhm.
have foreign stuff and new inventions and things like that.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing now so we can go back to thinking. I wonder whether, do you think Richard gets, do you think Richard gets harshly assessed by um, the characters in the play or by criticism? Because you're right about his um, extravagance, but that's not as emphasized as it might be. And I was thinking about Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II,
I was thinking
and
about
the
that too.
fact, yeah, there that that Edward has a um full on and sort of unabashed uh male lover, which is a
Hmm.
sort of that kind of slightly hangs about Richard, doesn't it? But never in a straightforward or an explicit way. And even when Richard does one of the worst things he perhaps does in our sight, which is to expropriate the lands of John of Gaunt, after that very disobliging speech about this Sceptred Isle. I mean, he does do it to make war in Ireland, doesn't he? He
Hmm.
doesn't say, I'm having all this money to buy gold
Yeah. Yeah.
things and, dancing and stuff. He says, this will fill our coffers for the war in Ireland, which might be seen to be appropriate kingly statecraft. Do you think we're a bit harsh in what or maybe let's put it another way. What does Richard do wrong? What's
Yeah.
wrong with Richard?
I totally agree. I was thinking of Edward the Second as well, where you get these like frankly comic scenes of him just being like, I'm gonna give all this money to my boyfriend like five different times. And it's like really obviously not good. And I think it connects to I'm gonna not really answer the question, I don't think. But the thing that it sort of put me in mind of is like uh I think we might judge Richard a little harshly, but I think that's because one of the things that I kind of talk about in the introduction and that I really believe about this play is that in one of its kind of ways of switching the mode towards tragedy is that it's so much more interested in the family dynamics than in the political dynamics. And so it doesn't really matter what Richard is spending the money on in the framing of the play. What matters is that he is dishonoring his uncle's memory when his body is barely cold in the bed. And the way that that whole kind of sequence gets set up, every time I've ever seen it performed, it gets a laugh because it's literally like someone comes in who's like, Gaunt's dead. He's like, oh, great, let's go.
Yes,
We got
let's
money
go.
now.
Yes.
Um, and so I think we're invited to judge Richard less on the basis of his political decision making, which frankly, yeah, we don't. All we get are people who already don't like him telling us he's doing a bad job. And similarly, the only explicit kind of reference to his male lovers we get is by someone who's about to execute someone who they're claiming is one of these male lovers. Like all of his crimes are kind of presented to us from pretty biased sources. But what we do get the kind of firsthand evidence of is him treating his family badly. There's an incredible scene really early on where Bolingbroke, his cousin, I'm already going to forget how they all connect to each other. His cousin has just been
Cousin
exiled.
is a good catch-all because
Yeah,
cousin is anything in this period, isn't it?
everything. Yeah, they're all just they're
Yeah, they're all
related.
cousins. We're all cousins.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
He's just exiled his cousin, his uncle is devastated. And then we get him and his, favorites all like gossiping about like, oh, did you see him go? Like, oh my God, yes, he was so upset. It was so boring. And so yeah, I find it really fascinating that like those are the terms in which we're repeatedly invited to kind of be a bit judgmental of Richard. But at the same time, both of these scenes I've described are really funny and everyone loves a funny character too. So it's a really like fascinating and kind of masterful balancing of sympathies on Shakespeare's part, I think. We really never, I don't think, are asked to hate Richard. Even the things he does that we're, as I say, invited to be critical of are framed in a way where we kind of enjoy watching them happen.
And do you think there's ever, conversely, a time when are we encouraged to like Bolingbroke?
That's a really interesting question. I find it hard to answer because I like
You like Bolingbroke?
yeah, I do, but I don't know if I don't know how much I'm meant to. I think that it's you know, I think it's undeniable that he is never allowed to have the charisma that Richard gets to have. Um, even
Is
in
the other
his
bit of your difference between political power and theatrical power.
he
So
is, yeah, I was
he's getting political power, but he never has theatrical power.
exactly. He gets kind of smaller and smaller. And I think it's one of the most fascinating things about the entire play to me is the way that really his entire rise happens off screen.
Off
And we kind of
stage, yeah.
don't know how it happens.
Yeah.
Um, in one scene, he's saying, "Hey, I'm just here to reclaim my father's title," and then in the next scene, people are like, "Oh yeah, he's going to be king." And Shakespeare does, I think, deliberately
Mm.
just doesn't even try to kind of square that circle. It just happened somehow. But yeah, the kind of only scene, the scene when he's kind of at his lowest, and in theory, in my little theory that I'm crafting here, has the most theatrical power. It's in the form of this kind of challenge. Two characters are both accusing each other of treason, so they decide they're gonna, do a have a duel about it, basically. And so it is this very kind of like theatrical event. There's a lot of pageantry, and they give these speeches, but obviously those speeches are a form of theatricality that doesn't make us feel closer to him. It is, so sort of formal that we're really, it's still distancing, even though it's a moment when he is very deliberately sort of seizing the stage and trying to leverage this theatricality to kind of make his point. And then Richard realizes that's what's happening and interrupts it before it can work.
Mm.
So even then, it's like his attempt at kind of grabbing theatrical power is sort of batted back by Richard's superior, at that stage, political power. And then he takes over the scene, and it doesn't go great for him either, but he ends up kind of getting what he wants. And then we do have the kind of one moment where I think, Bolingbroke is unequivocally sympathetic in the really kind of moving scene where he's saying goodbye to his father and gets, beautiful language about being in exile from his country. But it's kind of the one glimpse of him as like a person that we get. And then he comes back and he is sort of just a foil to Richard.
Do you think he's
Um,
going to be a better king than Richard, or is that the wrong
well,
question to ask?
are we allowed to think about Henry IV where it turns out not so much? Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely we are. And one of the things we need to ask is this is this a standalone play? Is this different if
yeah,
we don't think of it as a standalone play?
for sure. I mean, I do think that he sorry, I'm distracted because I can tell my dog is gearing up to start barking. Uh I think we certainly see that he can do the things that Richard can't. He understands like all the ways that Richard has been alienating people, has been kind of, the reasons that people turn against him are things that Bolingbroke understands how to do better. But Bolingbroke does not understand the theatricality and the pageantry of kingship the way that Richard does. And so I think it, yeah, I think it is a question that to me the play poses and doesn't necessarily answer, or leaves it for the viewer or the reader to answer, which is like, which of these matters more? The sort of like ineffable belief in the divinity and like kind of superiority of this person because they just seem better than us, or someone who understands how to pull the levers of power, get together an army, and get stuff done.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I suppose there's a critical history, isn't there, of saying this is a play about sort of epochal, if that's how you say that, shifts. This
Mm,
is feudalism giving way to something more, whatever comes after feudalism, something more sort of constitutional, something sort of power of the nobles, respect for property, respect for nobles' property and all that thing. So that Richard is a king who thinks he owns everything, and Bolingbroke is Henry becomes a king who realizes he rules with the support and the permission really of his noblemen, and that is part of a disenchantment or a wider historical shift. And I guess I'm just thinking about bits in the stage history where we see that we see a sort of Regency Richard, and then a darkly sober um,
mm,
Victorian Bolingbroke, or these look like representatives of a different political systems who happen to overlap temporally. And then I suppose there's the other model of it, which is actually they're more similar than they're different.
mm,
They're all This is not a kind of popular coup. This is one grandson or great grandson of the Black Prince or somebody being sort of shuffled out and another one shuffled in. This is not a play that's very interested in the people or what they might want, and that maybe that famous Stratford production back in the day where they apparently flipped a coin at the beginning to see who would be Richard and who would be Bolingbroke sort of says something about that. I mean, are you on the side of opposites, or so opposite they've come back to be the same person?
guess I incline more towards, yeah, the sort of two sides of a coin, I think, because I think that there's something really interesting that the play is doing with its kind of generations of characters. And this is one of the ways in which I think that like the kind of cast of secondary characters is more important than I think certainly stage history has often given them credit for, because we have this sort of generation of Richard's deceased father, the John of Gaunt and York, and like these old men who are kind of trying to maintain mostly just like order and normalcy. And then we have, the generation below of Bolingbroke and Richard and O'Merle, who is
Yeah.
also there, who are all articulating different theories of how power actually works and what what kingship actually should mean and do. Um, and I think that it is a sort of I think if there's a kind of shift, it's between these two generations and sort of Bolingbroke and Richard and parentheses Omerl kind of are the ones who all are articulating that things should be different from how
Mhm.
they have been, or things are different from how they have been,
Mm.
in contrast to their kind of fathers rather than necessarily in contrast to each other.
Yeah, that's a great way of seeing what is interrupted succession here, or not succession from one generation to the next, but horizontally across the generation. Let's talk a bit about the play as a single play versus as the initiation for a sequence.
Mm,
So I suppose as we've talked about it as a tragedy is a single play, and sort of is a heavily end-stopped play. But as you were saying, I was thinking as you were talking about the way the baton is handed over, and the apparently repentant Bolingbroke is talking about his own um, sort of forgiveness for this crime, and we also get, don't we, suddenly a mention of his son. So
yeah.
there is a bit of a sort of sort of sticky end, which is if you wanted the sort of the next bit, this is what it was going to hook onto. These are things which are unnecessary for the tragedy, but they are sort of future directed. How do you feel this play? Do you think of this play as a single play, or do you think of it as the start of a sequence?
My very hot take is I think of all the history plays as single plays, which I think is not something everyone will agree with fully.
Hmm.
But yeah, I absolutely think that this play stands alone, despite, as you say, these sort of like Easter eggs almost of the play to come. My other favorite one being like the random cameo appearance of Hotspur for like two scenes for no reason. Um, but I think that, it tells a complete story because, as you say, it is history. Whether the history that follows is Shakespeare's Henry IV or what somebody read one time about the reign of Henry IV in a book or a ballad that they heard and they kind of dimly know that like, oh yeah, there was a guy who did some stuff and fought the Scots. The Ballad of Chevy Chase, one of the most kind of famous ballads of like history. Um, you know, glancingly mentions Henry IV. So it's the history that follows doesn't necessarily have to be the history of Shakespeare's play because it is a thing that people might know from all sorts of ways. And these references to us are like, oh my gosh, it's Henry Percy. Of course, it's gonna the guy who will be Hotspur. But for somebody else, it's oh that guy who fought the Douglas, and there's a song about it that they sing down at the pub. And so I think that I think it's a sort of an illusion to me that, of course, these are threads that are meant to connect to Shakespeare's own, at this point, yet unwritten play. They're actually just reaching outwards to whatever history of England people might know from a range of sources. And the knowledge that everyone at a history play shares of like, these people all have lives after this. And not kind of the instead of sort of I guess he doesn't need to create the illusion of continuity because like
Mhm.
people know it already. It's an
Mm.
assumption that like if someone's not dead, they probably did something after
Mm.
this. And so I think the kind of open-endedness is only the open-endedness of like history. And in terms of the characters, I think we land at really satisfying conclusions for all of them, even for Bolingbroke who makes this vow to go to the Holy Land, blah blah blah. But like it feels like an ending.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like a cliffhanger.
Hmm. I, so that's a really interesting idea. That seems to me to be suggesting this is a sort of networked text because these that there is a discourse around history and historical figures that's multimedia in the period, and we have turned it into a serial text because of our author focus cued by the first folio 1623 so retrospectively. Yeah, I really buy that. I think that's great, and that this could either be a standalone play or it could have other sequels or continuations which are not necessarily Shakespearean or which nobody might even know were Shakespearean. Is it, does it feel interpretatively different if it's a single play or a sequence? I mean, I'm thinking about the sort of strong prevalence of Tudor myth theory, which
Mhm.
is that it's all the murder of Richard is the crime against God and nature and monarchy, which takes all the Wars of the Roses and everything to be expiated, and then we get the Tudors. So that's a long form moralized history, which says this the overthrow and the death of the murder of Richard was the most terrible thing that could have happened, and it took hundreds of years to get to sort it out. Whereas the play itself doesn't really suggest that this is the most. I mean, it suggests it's a bit of a shame, maybe, or it's sort of a
Like great.
bit sad how it turned out, but not. I guess the bishop, though, those people are saying that this is going to bring about carnage, and nobody can quite answer that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I have a couple thoughts about that. I mean, I think while we do have these references that in theory look ahead to Henry IV, which Shakespeare hadn't yet written, he had written The Wars of the Roses. So in some ways, I do think that those lines might be more direct references to something that he knows the audience might have seen of his own work, or even just, a joke for the people in the company to know, like, remember when we did that other play? Um, so I think that in a weird way, like there are pockets, it's sort of not so direct to the next plays, but kind of skipping ahead to the plays that come historically much later, but that he actually already wrote, which I think in a way is the same as he sort of networked, like this is a reference that he knows that people will have because he wrote it for them. But I'm so sorry, halfway through that, I forgot what the rest
No,
of the
so that's
question
right.
was.
So that the broader, I suppose, that expiation Tudor myth narrative,
Mm. Oh, yes.
in retrospect, it clarifies the politics of Richard II, which, as you brought out so beautifully, are very finely balanced. We don't know whether it's, as it were, the right thing for Bolingbroke to take the crown, or whether he'll be a better king, or whatever. But the Tudor myth reading of the play as a sequence settles that question by saying it was a terrible thing to do, and it took a long time. Not until the lovely Tudors came were we able to sort of get out from under the taint of this.
Yeah.
So it
And
unsettles the balance of the play in a way a bit retrospectively.
exactly, yeah. I mean, it emphasizes the thing that I think a lot of productions are already doing, which is making it a play only and entirely about how sad it is that all of this happened to Richard, and kind of doesn't pay enough attention to the various forces and ideas that are counterbalancing Richard and his perspective and the things that he thinks are, right, and the things that he thinks are crimes. And I think, having seen and also like worked on a couple sort of cycles of the history plays, where we go all the way through from Richard II to Henry V. I mean, the thing that always stands out to me is that, I mean, first of all, I think Richard II is much more boring when it's just only the story of Richard. Isn't it so sad watching this guy trudge towards his murder, rather than being something a little more kind of nuanced and rich and with lots of voices in it? It's also, by the time you get to Henry V, you've kind of forgotten that Richard II even happened. And I think that there are productions. There's a wonderful production by it was Druid Theatre in Ireland that, in Henry V, Henry has this like prayer the night before the battle where he references, my father killed Richard II, please don't take it out on me, God. That wasn't my doing. And they sort of had the ghost of Richard kind of appear behind him as he, did this prayer to kind of be like, remember
Mm.
what happened like 8 hours ago? But it's hard to kind of hold on to. And I also think, as you say, that sort of a backwards reading of like unequivocal crime is Henry, who didn't like his dad. That's his view of what happened. But I think also like the thing that always the thing when I see them kind of stitched together in this way that really kind of rings like I don't think this is what Shakespeare was thinking or what was intended, is that there are characters. I keep mentioning O'Merle. He's like a very minor character, but I do love him. And he is the Duke of York who shows up in Henry V. It's the same person. So if you're trying to tell a story about a generational crime that finally gets kind of expiated by the Tudors, that seems like a perfect line to draw between this guy who, betrayed betrayed Richard and then sides with Henry for the rest of,
Mm.
throughout Henry IV and into fighting alongside his son. But it's not relevant because Shakespeare doesn't care that they're the same person. And it's just not what he's thinking about at all by Henry V, I don't think, except for in
Yeah,
this passing reference.
so putting them all, the histories together, I mean, organizing the first folio by genre and making the histories so clearly an editorial category. You've talked about how the plays are asequential. I mean, both unsequential but also asequential. But the folio really overrides that, doesn't it? It says, well, this is the earliest king, and then these are the parts one, two, and three, and let's get it all in order. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
we could keep talking about this, but let's do it via. Let's try and look as if we're answering some questions. We've got some really, really great questions actually, and I'm going to take two first on. And thank you to the people who are answering other people's questions in the Q&A. That's really generous. Thank you. Um, We've got two questions which are quite interesting, which I thought might just give us one last go at the at that long speech. Panda says, surely the neatness and seamlessness of Richard's jailhouse formulation of his predicament is a classic manifestation of a narcissistic personality, rehearsed self-presentation, and not about feeling at all. Um, and then there's just another bit that I wanted to put alongside that, which was Dan. Is it about identity? One striking thing about the prison speech is that Richard is forced to try to inhabit an identity for which there is no clear set of intellectual or emotional conventions, i.e., that of an ex-king.
Mm.
That so then two ways of seeing that, and I just wondered if you wanted to. I'm glad to have given voice to both of those, but I wondered if you wanted to say anything in response.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I sort of glanced at this when we were talking about it and then immediately got distracted by other things. But I think that if one had to kind of define a single tragedy of the character of Richard, it is this lack of identity. And I think I resonate a little bit more with the second interpretation in that in the scene where he's getting deposed, this is his kind of, this the theme that he speaks at extensively. He's like, I have nothing, I don't even have my name. Like I was only ever a king from the time I was what, like 9 months old. And yeah, so the question of not only what is an ex-king, how can that be? I think that's also one of the things the play is asking, and that Richard insists there is no such thing as an ex-king. I can't be unkinged. You cannot wash all the water in the Hertford Sea, cannot wash the balm off an anointed king. Um, and yet, so what is a king in prison then? Like, it's still this idea of like, if I'm not a king, then I'm nothing, but I'm clearly not nothing. And I'm pretty sure I'm still a king, but a king shouldn't be in this situation. He doesn't have any self beneath that facade. And I guess, are all kings narcissists? Maybe. It's the question of, yeah, what is, if this identity is imposed upon you from basically the time you're born and you've never formulated a sense of self without it, and you don't even believe that you have a self without it, yeah, what could that be? So, yeah, I think that there's something really, I think that's absolutely part of the kind of like intricate thought that has gone into this, because he doesn't kind of know how to feel this. He has to like think it, because it is sort of an intellectual problem.
Hmm. Hmm. Thanks. Those were both really, really good questions. I'm going to take Mia Emilia's question now, which is because I think this is tailor-made for you, Hailey. Would love to hear your thoughts on the few female characters in the play and their function in it. And also asks about women playing Richard II. A couple of examples have been put into the Q&A, Fiona Shaw, the 2019 Globe production, and so on. But I wondered if we haven't touched on um, the Queen or anything. So
Yeah. Yes, I've written.
could you write a book about this maybe
I,
and
in fact, I
try
did.
and
Yeah, I mean, I think that the female characters in this play are so important because consistently they exist to give kind of voice to things that giving voice to ideas that are kind of being excluded from the centers of power. So the first female character we meet is the Duchess of Gloucester, who people often cut, which is huge mistake, because we've just had this long scene, all this pageantry where people are like, a treason happened, we're going to be very vague about what that means, and then she busts and she's like, Richard killed my husband. That is the problem that is no one is talking about. And this is, again, we get a sort of like parallel to this towards the end when the Duchess of York is trying to defend her son O'Merle, who has been correctly accused of treason. He didn't actually do it. He was just planning to do it. And then he got caught and decided not to do it. But a similar thing of like, I need to be heard, and injustice has happened. There's a thing that people are trying to trample over the course of, what I believe is right. And sort of sandwiched between these two women who are sort of very forceful in articulating kind of the things that they feel the play has forgotten. We have Richard's wife, who is kind of I'm my sort of metaphor of like things that are like forced outside is failing me. But basically, she's one of the things that is forced outside. She receives over and over some of the most important exposition in the play, in a way that just drives home like, shouldn't she have learned about this some other way? Like, shouldn't she have been part of this conversation that is being delivered to her? Like, famously, she overhears that Richard has been deposed by two gardeners who are gossiping about it. And she has a line that I'm not going to be able to quote that's like, I'm the last to know of this, that this tragedy most belongs to me, or something like that. Um, yeah, so I think that it's, you mentioned, this isn't a play, kind of, I think more than almost any other history play has almost no interest in the kind of the commons or the people or anything that's happening outside of this kind of family. But the female characters sort of represent, I think, in this play, the people who are pushed to the margins, not because of their class in this case, but because of their gender. And Shakespeare really makes a point of like putting really important information into their mouths and really emphasizing that like they are important, but they're just it's not lack of importance that has them at the margins. It's a lack of will to hear the things that they have to say.
Hmm. I'm going to keep going. There's a couple of questions. A question about the relationship between political pageantry, theatricality, and the theatrical representation and legitimation of political power, which I thought was interesting. Maybe we'll take that on its own, or maybe we'll put this. Do you think Richard is in a way pulling the play towards tragedy and away from history through his theatricalizing? Is this part of his downfall? Does he in part orchestrate it himself? I mean, I suppose they're both about self-conscious, how self-conscious is the theatricality.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we'll have this final point as well to see whether any of these you want to take up. Richard often understands his loss before anyone else articulates it, yet he continues to speak in elaborate, self-dramatizing language. Is Richard's eloquence a form of self-awareness or a way of aestheticizing his own political failure?
Hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. I love that last question in particular. Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm struggling to sort of say the things I'm thinking because I think that it's not, to me, I don't necessarily read it as a sort of like character choice in some ways. Like, I think that this theatricalization to me is something that very much is like a structural technique by Shakespeare rather than Shakespeare making a character who decides to theatricalize himself when he loses power. I think that there's elements of that in Richard, but when I think maybe it's just that I get distracted thinking of it in terms of the pattern that shows up across the plays where the same thing happens. And it happens to be that Richard is also a character who kind of has those tendencies, but that kind of retreat into theatrical power whilst lacking political power happens to all kinds of characters who don't have those traits. Like, I think not to keep referencing other plays, but Henry VI, I think is a great example where he is not at all a theatrical person. He would probably be a better king if he were, until he kind of has this moment sitting on a molehill and delivers this incredible soliloquy and like oversees this very theatrical moment of like bodies being moved across the battlefield and stuff. And that to me reflects the way that like it's not, I don't really read it as like a character making a choice as much as Shakespeare kind of imbuing them with a different kind of power than they had before. But even as I'm saying that, I'm thinking about the speech that you mentioned before, how his sort of response to setbacks is like, let's sit down on the ground and tell sad stories. Um, but even that is, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that really baffles me in a kind of fruitful way. Like, I think one of the things that keeps me really compelled by this play is like, why does Richard give up so easily? There's so many moments when, like, it kind of at the first setback, he just throws up his hands, and it connects to this question of like, how does Bolingbroke go from claiming he's only here to be, Duke of Lancaster to, oh, by the way, he's going to be king now. There's this kind of like void of motivation and explanation around like why he wins and why Richard gives up in a way, which is a digression from the point a little bit. But except for in that, yeah, like yes, I kind of do agree that he leaps to sort of mythologizing his own failure, but it's also like, but why?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I mean, that I really enjoyed that answer, and I also think it's a really sort of important bit of learning um, that the answer isn't always in character, and lots of tragedy study um, perhaps points us that way, and lots of the history of Shakespeare criticism has taught us to think that character is the unit of analysis rather than anything else. And I think you're pointing to something that is structural in theatrical terms as well as in political ones, which I think is really, really, really useful. Maybe we can think a bit more about those structural similarities, because there's a couple of questions asking about whether there are parallels with Hamlet.
mhm.
Dan asks about a mockery king of snow and this too solid flesh, and Vikash, I think, asks just about what are the similarities. Is there anything in your mind that you would want to bring forward about that?
Yeah, I think this is one of those moments when I always sort of step away from the play and think about the broader picture of like the context in which Shakespeare is writing, because Hamlet and this were written in relatively close proximity, I think a couple years apart, we think. Um, which says to me that he had an actor who he realized was really good at this. Um, Probably Richard Burbage, we assume. And, whenever I see a character type or a kind of set of scenarios or types of language that keep recurring across, especially a couple plays that are like back to back, I always think about the sort of pairs of women that we see in the sort of As You Like It, Twelfth Night, Much Ado About Nothing run. To me, I'm like, oh, there was somebody he was writing this for. He hit upon a formula that he either that was maybe selling really well or getting positive reception, or he just thought like, this guy's so good, I want to see him do this more. And Yeah, and I think that is, yeah, that's where I always go when I see especially these kind of like character based sort of echoes across plays, is that was for somebody.
Hmm. Let me just raise a couple of other points. As always, we've got more questions than we can answer. I'm just gonna read some of these out, and if you want to pick up any, but even if not, they're things for people to think about. What about the fact that it's all in verse? Sam says it's Shakespeare's finest but rarely performed. Why do you think that is? And related to that is a question from Andrea about the relative appreciation of Marlowe's Edward II and Richard II. Um, a question about Shakespeare's name appearing on the title page of the second edition, 1598, I think. Uh, is there something significant there? Um, Kibria's got a couple of really great points. The tension between tragic structure and historical continuity. Is Richard's inward turn in Act 5 Shakespeare's way of resisting history's forward momentum? In that sense, Richard II is less about succession than about what it feels to be dispossessed by history. That's completely lovely, really fascinating. Claire Wakeham picks up, thanks Claire, about that is exactly what I was thinking of, about different concepts of time with Oliver Burkeman's great book 4,000 Weeks. That's our lifespan, 4,000 weeks.
Mm.
Um, um, so you'll have had 1,000th of it by the time of the next webinar.
Mm.
Kibri again saying that Richard, another point about genre, so two really sort of interesting ways to think about genre. that Richard II deliberately resists being a closed, tragic text and instead more open, a kind of node in a larger historical um, conversation. Um, what about Richard seeing himself as a Christ figure? And then Bobby and Timbo both saying, isn't kingship doesn't seem to be all it's cracked up to be. Who would want to be a king?
Yeah. I mean, that's, I don't know where to start. Those are so many amazing questions. I just like
Pick
briefly,
up one thing that you
yeah,
that
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I'll say briefly, I've increasingly reading the history plays have become convinced Shakespeare agrees with you. Kingship, don't do it, not worth it. Which I think is fascinating and a whole other subject of study. Um, I wanted to, predictably for me, I have to talk about performance, and why I think this is rarely performed. And I think part of it, and one of the things that I was like really actively trying to do in my introduction is I think people are afraid of the history plays, period. And I think this one especially, there's a lot of, recitation of genealogies, and the seven sons had seven sons, and the Black Prince, and all these people who we talk about and never see, but are clearly very important. And I remember, like, I think I said to you early on, like, I don't want a family tree in it. I refused to put one in because I was really determined to introduce the play in a way that drove home that you can think about these as contained, characters. You don't have to worry about the family tree. You can track the relationships just based on what is in the text. And you don't have to know if somebody's like an uncle or a cousin as long as you understand that they're family and they have a blood relationship of some kind. Um, but I think that that contributes to why this play is rarely performed because it is, at a glance, it feels really dense, and people think about all the family trees they're going to have to put in the program, and they get scared away. Unlike Richard III has Richard, who is so compelling and kind of frees you from the fear of the complicatedness of the rest of that play. Henry IV plays have Falstaff. Henry V's got the rousing Agincourt speeches. Like they all sort of have something to anchor in if you're afraid of the history that this play, I think, is perceived to lack. And I think it's really telling that when it happens, there's been some references to it in the Q&A I saw. It's a star vehicle. So we got David Tennant, we just had Jonathan Bailey, and it's obviously not only, but that tends to be how it gets done. Is an actor says, "Well, I want to play Richard," and I think the unfortunate side effect of that is it really reinforces the idea that this is the story only of Richard, and it's this one guy's tragedy, and all these cousins and uncles and stuff are just confusing weird stuff on the side, but we don't have to worry about them because this is about Jonathan Bailey. And I think that's a shame. I think it deserves better than that.
I wonder if one of the reasons, if Sam's right that it's not performed much now, I wonder if that nuance and balance that you've talked about is a bit ill-suited to the binary politics of our time. Actually, we want the histories to be political. It's not completely
Mm.
clear what the political message of this play is, or could be. But yeah, really, I'm going to have to wind up. I'm so sorry if we haven't got to your question. If you're really um, want to pursue it, do ping an email to me at Oxford, and I'll have a go at answering it. That's not something I commit our guests to doing after the
I'm
fact.
happy to.
Um, I'll send them on to you, Hailey, if I
Yeah.
need to. We're going to finish up. I'm going to ask Hailey for one suggestion of what you might follow up with if you're really interested in taking Richard II further after looking at her World's Classics introduction. And while she's thinking of that, I'll just remind you that our next webinar will be on Cymbeline, and I'll be talking to Kim Gilchrist about his introduction to that play. So what do you think, Hailey? What should we go to next on Richard II?
Um, I'm gonna have to go back to a production that I already alluded to. I believe there is a recording of this 2015 Globe production, and I just think it is one of the most sort of well-rounded versions of it. I think it really gives a sense of a lot of the things that I love best about the play in terms of its sort of ensemble nature. And so I think if you are kind of wanting to see whether everything I argue for in my introduction is complete nonsense, hopefully that could be an argument in favor of my view of the play. Yeah, that's what I'd say.
Brilliant, brilliant. And if you can't get hold of that, there's been a couple of mentions. Edel mentioned the Hollow Crown, Ben Whishaw. Now that very much is not an ensemble. That's a very different kind of take. So that would be the contrast there. Brilliant. Enjoy that. Do join us next time. And thanks to Hailey Bachrach so much for the conversation. Thanks, Hailey.
For having me. Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thanks, everyone.